Hello and welcome to our book club. I'm Minnie Menon, and today we have a very special guest with us, someone who's been part of the LHI Circle story and, in fact, live history in their story for a very long time. Vijay Balan joins us from Atlanta in the US, and he is the author of this gripping book called The Swaraj Spy. What's interesting about this book is the fact that it's written by a man who's actually a trained rocket scientist. He's done a whole lifetime of work as an engineer in the US. But this is a story which is obviously one that has been close to Vijay's heart, because it is a fiction piece based on factual events of a family member who actually witnessed one of the most tumultuous period of the 20th century history, the Second World War, and the formation of the Indian National Army. Vijay, it's such a pleasure to have you in this avatar on this show, because we've often connected you as a viewer as part of other LHI Circle events and programs. And I'm very, very happy to have you with us today, especially since we also got a chance to meet up when you were in Mumbai last.
Thank you so much, Minnie. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Right. You know, Vijay, we rarely get books which are based on fiction. The last fiction writer we had was Ashwin Sanghi on his book. But you know what I like about your work and what Ashwin did was, of course, the research that went into it. Because when you weave a story of fiction based on research and such a lot of factual information, it's quite spectacular, because it's a gripping coming together of the imagination of an author and deep research. So I'm going to start by asking a simple question. Why did you write it as a fiction piece? Because it is so biographical. I mean, it is a story of your granduncle, broadly speaking. Why look at it from a fiction point of view?
In order to put this story together, it took me about 6.5 years worth of work and a lot of travel and so on. And it was like putting together an old jigsaw puzzle with many, many pieces missing. But the reason why I chose to use my narrative skills to kind of shape the facts into a story is because of the audience that I chose to write for. I wrote this book for an average person, not a scholar or even a history buff. So what I did was I took the researched facts and then put that in the form of a story, because as I often say, history is really his story or her story or their story. And so I chose to kind of use the narrative vehicle to tell the story and at the same time kind of convey the history. In fact, a reader actually told me that after she had finished the book and put the book away, she had realized that she had actually learned a lot of history. Then that was exactly my objective.
So, you know, when I was reading the story, Vijay, what also stood out for me is, you know, how you've been able to bring out facets which were little known. For example, the early years of the INA in Singapore. You know, while we associate the INA and the Indian National Army with Subhash Chandra Bose, the early phase is very little known. So how difficult or easy was it to put this jigsaw together, and where all did it take you in terms of research, in terms of travel?
Okay, that point about the INA is absolutely spot on, because most people don't know that there was an INA before the one that everybody knows about, which is led by Netaji. And that INA was led by a man called Captain Mohan Singh. And that version of the avatar of the INA collapsed because of tensions between the Japanese and the Indians. So it wasn't always hunky-dory. But to come back to your question, the seeds of the story was planted in my head by my dad, my late dad, because to him, his uncle was this man, T.P. Kumaran Nair, who's the protagonist in the story, was a hero. So those little pieces that my dad had told me kind of kept rattling around in my head over the years. And then about 13 years ago, I had kind of an epiphany saying, wow, I should write this book. And then I looked around and there was nothing. The trail had gone completely cold. So I started with family, and I was able to get a lot of info from family, including, by the way, letters that he had written. He actually got them smuggled to get it past British censors. And those letters gave me a very good insight into his mind and how his mind, his outlook had changed from being kind of a gung-ho paramilitary officer to someone who's a lot more reflective. But then beyond that, I did a fair amount of travel. As you said, I live in Atlanta in the US. I made several trips to India to not only talk to people, but also to get a visual reference of the places that I wanted to write about, because I tend to be a pretty visual writer. What I try to do is to take you as the reader and put you there in that place to see and hear and smell what my characters are experiencing. But it was interesting, Minnie, that when you get to Southeast Asia, going to modern day Singapore doesn't tell me much because it's all steel and glass. So I must have spent, if you put all of the hours together, maybe weeks on YouTube looking at videos of what old Singapore looked like during the war. What did it sound like during a bombing raid and things of that sort. So I complemented travel with the info from places like YouTube. When it got to Burma, Myanmar, it was too dangerous to travel there. So what I did was, since I knew where this man had gone, I used Google Earth. So I was able to sit in my study here in Atlanta and zoom down to Rangoon, Yangon, as they call it now, Kaliwa, Falam, places like that, and to really understand what did that landscape look like, because Burma hasn't changed much since the war years. And so all of that helped me kind of put the story together. I was also able to get my hands on documents that helped me understand the missing pieces of the story, which I wasn't able to get from the family. So it was a very interesting process of putting all of this together and then fashioning it into a narrative.
Singapore was in the thick of things, and when we talk about the Second World War, we have a tendency to look westwards, right? It's always what happened in Europe, not enough of what happened in Southeast Asia. Now, this also humanizes the story. You suddenly, get to see a facet of a community that was, trying to establish itself, a family that was trying to establish themselves in Singapore and taking advantage of the opportunities over there. And suddenly something cataclysmic like the coming of the Japanese happens over there, and they are in the thick of events. When you're piecing this together and writing, what were the ideas or the feelings that you went through? Because it was so close to home also, because there was such a lot of uncertainty, risks, danger in that period.
Exactly. That's a great question. So one of the things that I chose to do, going back to my objective of making this history available and approachable by as many people as possible, what I chose to do, Minnie, is rather than talk about these global events, the strategy or the war or the tactics, what I chose to do were two things. I chose a pretty evocative style of writing, as I said, to take my reader there, to make it easily approachable. And the second thing that I chose to do was to talk about how these global events affect ordinary people. The protagonist of the story, who is in the zone, dealing with the sudden arrival of the Japanese, and then him joining a spy school in Penang, established both by Japanese intelligence and the Indian National Army, and also his wife, whom he had just married before he left for Singapore, back in Calicut, dealing with her husband somewhere behind enemy lines, maybe alive, maybe dead, but she deals with it in a very unique way. So what I chose to do is to bring all of this complex, cluttered history to the level of how does all of this affect people and their lives. So that's one of the vehicles that I use to make, hopefully, this story easily approached.
The Japanese occupation in Singapore has left scars and obvious scars. When you were researching in Singapore, what did you come across? I mean, there were terrible massacres, there were terrible atrocities that happened, and that kind of also cast a shadow on the way Singapore sees the INA, for instance, right? How did you what did research throw up for you?
Indeed. I mean, the Japanese were not choir boys. I mean, they were pretty brutal, particularly against the Chinese, with whom they had a war and they had occupied parts of China even before World War II started. And there were terrible, terrible atrocities. And as well, it's interesting to take a look at, yes, I mean, within the context of the INA, the Japanese were our allies to help India gain freedom. But, big powers will do what big powers will do. I mean, in some ways, I look at Japan and Great Britain as very similar. They're both island states hanging off the side of massive continents without resources. And what do you do when you're in a situation like that? You go grab it. It's just that the British started 3 centuries earlier and established an empire. So the Japanese got into the game saying, like, oh, we need one of those too. We're going to go get ourselves an empire, right? But even within the context of the story of this Indian National Army, I alluded to the tension between the Japanese and the Indians in that the first version of the INA. Okay, getting a little bit into the book. One of the things that the Indian National Army and its political wing, the Indian Independence League, did was they crafted a resolution. It was called the Bangkok Resolution. And one of the things that they asked for was an explicit written commitment by Japan that it did not have colonial designs on India, because at the end of the day, it wouldn't have made any sense to just exchange the Japanese for the British for the Japanese. The Japanese never signed that agreement. Not during the first INA, and after its collapse, not under the INA under both either. So, the fact is, the old African saying, right? When you dance with elephants, the grass can be crushed. So it throws up a bunch of questions in terms of who are the good guys and the bad guys in all of this. I mean, the British were colonial powers. Clearly, we weren't too happy with them. But were the Japanese really good guys? Were they trying to use the INA? And how would the INA have fared had the Japanese succeeded? Would we have to turn around? We had to turn around and fight the Japanese later? These are interesting questions to speculate on.
So there's a lot of pointers on the Japanese that comes through in this book. And that kind of fascinated me, because if you're a student of history, you do like to see, and I think a lot of your research would have got the human side of it. One, of course, was the fact that even the early joinees, were inspired or motivated by this whole war cry that the Japanese had on clearing up Asia and getting Asia back to Asians. It was a kind of a nationalistic Asia nationalism, so to say, at that point. It kind of rings hollow when you see what they did to the communities that they actually came to rule in that small, short period when they were in control.
Yes, indeed. They crafted this notion called the Greater Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, quite a mouthful, as kind of the capstone of this notion of Asia for Asians, right? But in essence, what they were doing is they were throwing the old imperial powers out, the British, the French, and the Dutch, and they were going to supplant themselves into that situation, perhaps having puppet governments. I mean, what they did in Manchukuo, in Manchuria and China, perhaps is a case study where they put in a puppet government, nominal independence, but they were kind of pulling the strings behind the scenes. Now, would they have done that had they succeeded? We don't know. But I think the lesson in this is, powers will do whatever they see is in their strategic national interest. And those that ally with them have to be careful to make sure that, they don't get swept away in that process. So this whole notion of what was the Japanese objective and what may have happened had the war turned out differently is a fascinating question.
Also, it puts a lot of questions on the role of the INA itself, and of course, today in history, you have a tendency to look at such events with rose-tinted glasses. You have a one-way approach to see something like the INA. But what is your understanding of the INA after going through such a personal journey of discovery? Because the two things that stand out for me, the first is that it was largely prisoners of war who were part of that. And very early, like you said, they began to understand that the Japanese were not what they seemed to be. So this whole Japanese axis, was questioned from within the INA. How do you see with the INA itself kind of evolve in those 3-4 years?
Okay. There were two groups of people that joined the INA. One were the POWs who chose to join the INA. In fact, in the book, I talk about this event at a place called Farrer Park in Singapore, where right after Singapore fell, the Japanese separated the Indian soldiers from the British officers and gathered several thousand of them in this park, which used to be a race course, and announced the formation of the INA. And the soldiers that were there enthusiastically joined. Now, there was a set of those POWs who chose not to join the INA as well because of the oath of allegiance to Britain. But there were also civilians who joined the other parts of the INA. For example, this spy school that I talked about, which is kind of the central element in this story, 34 people were trained, and they were all civilians who were from the local population in Malaya. In addition to those people, the women's regiment of the INA, after Bose took it over, the Jhansi regiment, which was led by Captain Lakshmi Sehgal, was made up of local women. So it was both civilians as well as POWs that joined the INA. But coming back to your question, the INA failed tactically in that by the time the Japanese, let me say one other thing. The Japanese swept all the way through Burma, and they were on the frontiers of India in 1942. But they chose not to go any further, even though the INA wanted them to, because the INA's objective was to liberate India. The Japanese wanted to kind of stop there because they were busy fighting the Americans. But 2 years later, they did invade India, and there were two great battles in Imphal and Kohima.
Yeah.
And the INA joined them in that. In fact, the INA came as far as a place called Moirang, close to Imphal. But then it was too late by then because the British had established their defense lines and the Americans had got involved. And so the Japanese were destroyed. And so was the INA in 1944, leading to 45. But it's my opinion, and this is just my thought, that although the INA failed tactically, they succeeded strategically. And let me tell you why. Because after the end of the war, there were 3 INA prisoners of war at that time who were put on trial: Shahnawaz, Dhillon, and Sehgal, and a Hindu, a Sikh, and a Muslim. And they were tried at the Red Fort. And the British objective was to make them an example, try them for treason, and execute them.
Yes.
And it was not an in-camera trial, it was a public trial. And that caught the imagination of the entire nation, and it became a huge event. And eventually the British, tactically decided to acquit those 3 soldiers. Shortly after that, in 1946, the Royal Indian Navy mutinied. So
and of course, that was a big turning point because it was the first time that the forces were trading their guns on their seniors or their officers.
Bingo. So by then, it's my belief, and Clement Attlee is supposed to have said as much when he visited India in 1956. Attlee, of course, being the prime minister when India got independence. That it's my opinion that the British had lost confidence in their ability to hold India together through the use of the armed forces. Because, as you know, India throughout its colonial history was held together by Indians. The Indian civil service bureaucracy and the British Indian Army is what helped Britain not only hold India, but to go fight its wars elsewhere. And it's my belief that because of the INA, And because of the Royal Indian Navy mutiny, the British had lost confidence in the fact that they could hold this place together. But because otherwise, take a look at the colonial construct. It's basically extracting raw materials from your colonies, doing the value add in your home country, and selling it at higher prices in your colony. The British would have loved to keep on doing that until the cows came home, but they couldn't, in my belief, because it was getting expensive. But it was also, I think, the fact that their confidence got shaken in these institutions, the British Indian Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. So I think the INA perhaps fails tactically. It got destroyed, but I think it succeeded strategically.
There are moments that during the Japanese occupation where I haven't been able to rationalize why the INA didn't take offense to the kind of atrocities against some of the communities, or what was happening to prisoners of war, Indian prisoners of war. A lot of this information came post the defeat of the Japanese, of course. But do you think in that environment, how were impressionable minds like that of your granduncle Kumar shaped? There wouldn't have been that much of information, because it's always easy to look at the rearview mirror and look at it as black and white. But history is always shades of gray, isn't it?
Indeed, absolutely. It's cluttered and confusing, and that's what makes it fascinating. My guess is that, and I don't have access to this info as to whether my granduncle really knew about what the Japanese were doing to Indian POWs. He did witness some atrocities that were conducted against the Chinese that I have in my book. So my guess is that, there are certain things that you filter out and focus on the objective at hand, which was, how can we leverage this relationship with the Japanese to gain independence for India? And, as you said, when you look at it in hindsight, and hindsight always being 2020, you can always pick and choose and say, why did they do this, and what are the moral hazard aspect of it? For example, kind of skipping a little bit, before, and this is Netaji Subhash Bose, before he came to Southeast Asia to resurrect the INA, he was in Europe trying to get Hitler to create an Indian Legion to achieve the same objective. So one can ask questions about, okay, Hitler, clearly, the arguably, if not the worst, one of the greatest mass murderers in history, right? So how do you kind of ally with someone like that? But I will also quote Churchill, who said that if it means defeating Hitler, I will sup with the devil himself, as a way of justifying the relationship with Stalin. So it's realpolitik, right? Yeah. People make these calculations in perhaps a cynical way, but that is what history has been for centuries.
Right. And of course, the thing about the INA is that it was on the wrong side of history if you look at how it went. And hence, it doesn't get enough attention. And when it does get attention, it is a very colored attention, either a very pro-INA attention or a very anti that period attention, which I think doesn't serve the purpose, because you can't critically look at it, because it did inspire so many people. It was an important milestone. And of course, it also did some great work. So I'm going to come back to the last phase. And before that, the Swaraj Spy School itself, which is inspired the name of the book. It was a very interesting period when, these young Indians were sent back to India for espionage, etc. And you make a very telling point where you say that the Japanese didn't seem to know what they were doing. They sent the wrong boys in the wrong places. There were lots of tactical errors. So, the whole machinery of Japanese intelligence, etc. What does it say about it? Or do you think this was just a piecemeal kind of an effort? It was just an outfit of the Japanese doing this? I mean, how do you reconcile these pointers?
That's a great question. Okay, so this school itself was set in Penang, and they trained 34 civilians. but they only trained them for a few weeks and they were not ready to be sent. Okay. Now, they were sent prematurely because the Quit India movement had just broken out in India. And the man who ran the spy school, the Japanese person, Colonel Iwakuro, was kind of a political officer. So he felt that now is the time to strike the iron. And he sent these men to India, poorly trained. And as you said, they sent a bunch of people from South India to Gujarat, and where they couldn't speak the language and so on. But he was in a hurry to do it because he thought he could achieve his objectives. But all of that came a cropper because I think they really did not. There were two things that contributed. One is this man's impetuousness and hurry. And second, the Japanese really didn't get how incredibly diverse and complex India was. And by the way, they sent these spies to India without telling their Indian partners. And that's one of the reasons why that whole first INA collapsed. In fact, that specific event of sending the spies prematurely was the last straw that broke the camel's back. As well, the first batch of 20 that were sent were betrayed by a double agent. It was an officer who was part of the British Indian Army, who had supposedly joined the INA, but was sending information to the British. So lots of nuances, right, in terms of loyalties and motivations. So after these first 20s, there were 4 batches. 2 were sent by overland and 2 were sent by submarine. They were all caught to the last man, which basically means that the British knew exactly who was coming and where. So after all of that happened, my granduncle Kumar was sent on a rescue mission to find out what happened to these people. But he was sent with 2 very conflicting messages. The Japanese told him, Iwakuro and his people told him, to go to India, identify the surviving agents, and continue the mission, which is to spy on air bases and naval bases and so on. But the Indian side, the INA, told my granduncle to go identify these surviving agents and go to ground and hide till the end of the war because they had stopped trusting the Japanese. So some fascinating nuances, which, as you said earlier, are not known.
Are not known at all. And then, of course, the final leg of the trial itself of Kumar, the main protagonist, who's based on your granduncle getting caught, and that very painful trial that goes on. It could well be a script of a film in itself. What happened at that point. But as you were going through it, what were the new discoveries for you and the family when you were actually going through these papers?
Well, I tell you what, I mean, the part that fascinated me as I went through that aspect of that part of the story, without giving away the end, is how this man's mind had changed. Lots of info from the family as to how much of a motivated, driven person he was. As a matter of fact, as you know, the story starts with him refusing to follow an order to disperse a group of women protesters in Madras on Marina Beach. So he was a very committed kind of person who made decisions very quickly and carried them through. But as I was reading letters that he had written, I find a very different person. He had become pretty reflective, perhaps even spiritual, if I were to use that word, in terms of seeing his life in a very different light because everything that had happened to him. So I found that fascinating, and I found that very moving, and at a personal level. And it also, to be very honest with you, Minnie, it made me start reflecting on my own life and how, when we think that certain things are extremely important and critical, and how in the big picture they may not really matter much. So that whole transformation of that man's mind and how his wife Malu dealt with all of that, I found that incredibly moving and fascinating.
And Malu was just 23, and he
Correct.
was barely 41. I mean, that's the importance, as I said, of a story like this. It tells you about the human fallout of a great event. We always look at history as big events, turning points, etc. But it's the fallout, the emotional fallout, the impact it has on everyday life that we, as historians, never look at. And I think that's the personal journey that I really enjoyed in the book. And that's why I think more such books need to be written.
Well, I mean, this is one of many, many stories of unknown heroes. And, just the research that I did for this book just threw out so many other strands of very similar stories of people who have kind of been forgotten. The only legacy that exists today is there is a road named after him in Calicut called T.P. Kumaran Nair Road, which ironically there is a highway that's been built that kind of almost supplants this road that was there. It's kind of metaphorical in some ways. There are so many such stories, Minnie, that I think need to be surfaced and talked about. And back to your earlier point, I think this whole episode of India's freedom struggle needs to be looked at and discussed in in a more critical way, and not in kind of a black and white way in which it's either hagiography or a different point of view where people are just kind of not acknowledged. I think these nuances, because history is never black and white. There's so many shades of gray that I think need to be analyzed and studied. And again, as I said, that was one of the reasons I chose to write the book in the way I did, to get the average reader to read this and start thinking about, okay, who was right and who was wrong here, because there are no rights and wrongs here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more, because that's what we need. And that's what Live History India stands for. Getting different perspectives, because you can never understand a moment in history by looking at it in a singular way. You have to look at it from different facets to even understand. And I think the understanding is a continuous process. Every new work, every new book around a theme actually adds to our combined knowledge. And I think that's what you've done. One last question. I was very curious to find out, as you were opening up the story of your grand uncle, did you come across other stories? Did you connect with other families of people who might not have gone on a journey of discovery like you, but kind of got helped in their own journeys through this work?
Well, I didn't run across people who were on a similar journey as mine, but I did, through luck, if you will, get in touch with people. I ran across people who were who knew my granduncle and who were in fact trained with him. I'll tell you one quick story. I was talking to a cousin of mine who's a retired colonel in the army, and I was in India at that time. And I told him the story, and he looked at me and said, "Hey, I've heard this story." And I said, "No, you couldn't have." And he said, "No, there's this old man who lives in the next building, and he has told me a very similar story." And I said, "Okay, tell me his name." And he told me his name, and I know the names of the 34 people who were trained, and it was one of them. So I jumped on a plane, flew up to Pune, spoke to this man. He was in his 90s, mind was sharp, and he told me a few things about what had happened at the Penang spy school, because otherwise, I had to rely on documents. So that was just a fascinating coincidence. And then kind of not directly, but indirectly, I had approached Captain Lakshmi Sehgal to ask her if she knew about my granduncle. And she was in her 90s at that time, so she was kind enough to ask her daughter, Subhashni Ali, to read that email to her. And she told Subhashni to tell me that she didn't know my granduncle, but my granduncle was a great friend of her nephew, a man called Kuti, who is a character in my book. So I was able to get, in contact with people who had kind of first-hand knowledge or connections with that period and that time.
Right. How lovely. That is, thank you so much, Vijay, for writing this book, for sharing your story and all the years of research that have gone into this book, The Swaraj Spy, a book that you must read to understand and get a different facet to an event that we all think we know about, but there's so many aspects that we don't know about. Vijay, always a pleasure to meet you and speak to you, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Minnie. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for making me part of the LHI story.
Thank you.